Hello, my name is Karin Wells, and I'm here today to talk about my book. It's called The Abortion Caravan: When Women Shut Down Government in the Battle for the Right to Choose. And this is what it looks like, the abortion caravan. On the back, there's a photograph of the Volkswagen van they drove across the country with, on the top of it, a big black coffin. And I'll tell you more about that in a minute. First, I would like to really thank Glad Day Books for partnering in this virtual launch. And it's all we can do these days, learning it as we go along. And 3 cheers for everyone who's part of this. The Abortion Caravan was a group of 17 women from Vancouver. Very important that they were from Vancouver. They were young, left-wing women who were looking to start the revolution to change the world, as many people were in the late 60s. They wanted to change the world as it pertained to the way women lived. They wanted to liberate women. They were called a liberation group, not feminists, and that was an important distinction. A strong ideological base here. The physical manifestation of the caravan was 3 vehicles to begin with: a Pontiac Parisienne convertible, a great big boat of a thing, a pickup truck with huge loudspeakers out the side, and that van, that Volkswagen van. The coffin on the top symbolized the numbers of women who died every year in Canada as a result of illegal abortion, between 1,000 and 2,000. And the coffin was such a potent and clever symbol. It attracted attention everywhere. Abortion was an offense under the criminal code. Women could be prosecuted for seeking abortion, seldom were. Doctors could and were prosecuted. They were charged, convicted, jailed, lost their medical license. As a result of that, women turned to backstreet abortionists who had little regard for hygienic practices, who didn't stick around to see that things really turned out well, who charged women money, obviously. And that meant death, that meant infection, that meant infertility, and it meant all these women dying. So abortion was strategically chosen as the issue for the caravan. This thought of as the issue that affected a greater range of women, young women, older women who already had their families, who couldn't afford another baby. Women with money, they had an easier time of it. They could fly out of the country to another jurisdiction, or poor women who had a terrible time. So this was the issue. It wasn't called the daycare caravan or the equal pay for equal work caravan. This was the issue that would carry them. They set off from Vancouver. They stopped in, I think, 10 different places, slept on the very hard floors of United Church halls. They staged guerrilla theater at every town. They had rallies. They made a noise. Music blasted from those loudspeakers, and they got themselves noticed. That was the idea. They had also written and demanded a meeting with government, and demanded, not asked, demanded that abortion be taken out of the criminal code. They didn't get encouraging answers. Nonetheless, off they went to Ottawa. They were 500 strong. They marched on Parliament Hill. No one from government, which at that time was led by Pierre Trudeau, Justin's father, no one from government came to meet them. They were very angry. They left the Hill. They went back to the school where they were billeted, and they had a meeting. There were 200 of them. They had, a meeting of 200 people. They had a meeting that lasted 16 hours, and they reached a consensus decision that what they would do the next day was they would get themselves into the galleries of the House of Commons. They had to find nice middle-class clothes because they weren't particularly well dressed, which they did. And they would chain themselves to their seats and begin a speech. And they'd all memorize the same speech. As soon as the guards came to take one of them away, another one would pop up and continue the speech. They did this so well and they kept going for so long, and they were so noisy that eventually the speaker closed down that session of the House that day. They were on the front page of every newspaper in Canada the next day. They had made their point. They had got noticed. They had demanded attention, and they had received attention. And the miracle was they hadn't been arrested. That's something else again. The women will tell you the principal reason that they got away with it is that they were underestimated. Nobody thought women were capable of such a thing or would do, had the audacity to do such a thing. They did. And this was the beginning of a grassroots women's movement across the country, a movement, as it were, with strength and guts. So that's the basic story of the Abortion Caravan. There were many interesting and curious women who were part of this, and I wanted to look at who they were and why they did what they did, and there's lots of interesting stuff in that. They got to Toronto, and it was not easy because when they left BC and as they went through the West, there weren't very many of them. This was their show. They were in control and they knew what they wanted to do. They also knew they needed numbers to have an impact in Ottawa. They needed the numbers that they thought they would gain from Toronto. But the Toronto women didn't necessarily have much time for this group of women from the West. They knew nothing of what they'd done. There was no social media. They had a great deal of difficulty convincing. The day before they arrived in Toronto, they had come down from Sudbury. They read about the Kent State shootings. There were huge anti-Vietnam demonstrations happening in the United States. The Ohio National Guard had come in, had shot 4 students in Kent State in Ohio, killed 2 young women. And this was absolutely shocking. And this had made them very nervous coming into this milieu and into the big city. So the morning the caravan left Sudbury, the student strikes in the United States had spread to more than 400 university and college campuses. Neil Young had written 4 dead in Ohio within 48 hours of the Kent State shootings. The foment against the war in Vietnam reverberated into Canada. In Toronto, 500 protesters gathered outside the US consulate. What promised to be huge public demonstrations were planned on the Saturday in Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal. It wasn't a good time to put a new issue on the table. The caravan and Abortion on Demand were in danger of being swamped by a much bigger wave of protest. The more reports about the anti-war demonstrations the caravan women heard on the radio, the more apprehensive they became. Friends told them that there were riots in Toronto. Women looked for phone booths at every stop and called anyone they knew in Toronto. The woman driving the Volkswagen van sat high up, eyes on the road, and took it all in stride. I remember thinking, Kathy Walker said, this is to be expected. I'm amazed there hasn't been more in the heat of all these anti-Vietnam protests. The States was violent. Another woman was angry. How could anyone do that? The rest of the women took refuge in the old adage, things like that don't happen in Canada. The van led the 5-vehicle caravan south along the east side of Georgian Bay. The more cars they added to the caravan, the slower they seemed to go. They were only ever as fast as their oldest car. And as they went, it wasn't only the anti-Vietnam demonstrations weighing on their minds. They were thinking about this next chapter of the caravan. They all instinctively knew that the dynamics were about to change. When they left Vancouver, they were 17 women running their own shows, setting the rules, making the decisions. It had been easy enough to absorb the few women they had picked up in Regina and in Winnipeg into their everyday routines. Toronto would be different. It wouldn't be 6 or 8 or even 20 women joining the caravan. It could be hundreds, busloads of women. The Vancouver women would be outnumbered and in the back of the minds of some, outclassed. The women from the Toronto liberation movement were considered to be the heavies of the women's liberation movement in Canada. They were the first such group in the country. They were the biggest, the most self-assured. It was easy to feel intimidated. The caravan women were not comfortable with what was on the horizon. So that's how they felt going into Toronto. I'll just say, not without a struggle, but eventually worked, and they came out of Toronto, yes, with busloads of women heading to Ottawa and to this confrontation with government. This is part of our history. And I want to also thank the Feminist History Society, which is backed a series of publications telling stories of what women did in this country, stories that were in danger of being forgotten. This Abortion Caravan is a fine yarn. Buy the book, please. Thank you.